As the air war picked up momentum, the first aerial combat took place. A jubilant Saudi pilot returned with gun camera videotape to prove he had met 2 Iraqi fighters and brought them down.
3-4, no right. Okay, let's proceed back up.
Negative 20, say ID abandoned.
Roger, bandit, both target destroyed, both target destroyed.
But not all of the coalition's pilots were as lucky. Some had been shot down over Iraq and captured by the Iraqis. In violation of the Geneva Conventions about the display of prisoners, Saddam paraded a group of battered pilots before his television cameras. We would later learn that many of their injuries had been caused when they ejected from their planes. Some, like Lieutenant Jeffrey Zahn, were forced to make statements about the war.
I think our leaders and our people have wrongly attacked the peaceful people of Iraq.
Right from the start, there had been little opposition from the 700-plane Iraqi Air Force. In the early strikes, many of their runways had been deeply cratered by the bombing. Many other Iraqi planes had been caught on the ground or destroyed in their fortified bunkers. But throughout the war, Saddam still had a sizable Air Force left. Yet, for some reason, the majority of his pilots chose not to come out and fight. The most successful flights the Iraqis did manage were runs to the safety of airfields in Iran. More than 138 of Saddam's best MiGs, Mirages, and other planes ended up parked in havens across the border. Iran maintained a neutral posture toward its old enemy. It said it would intern both pilots and planes for the duration of the war. The war had its psychological effects here at home. Saddam Hussein had issued a call for attacks against American interests. There was mounting fear that somehow terrorists would be able to strike targets within the United States. The airlines began a policy of strict security, but it wasn't enough to calm the fear. Many people simply canceled their travel plans, and thousands of airline seats went empty.
Unattended baggage will be removed by the police immediately.
Super Bowl Souvenirs here!
And then there was the question of whether an America at war would still play the Super Bowl. The answer was yes. It was something the troops wanted to happen.
This is the year of the Giants!
SCUD's at halftime!
That life. Buffalo! Yeah!
The fans who went to Tampa's stadium found it an armed fortress.
Once you're in, you're in. You never get out.
I think that America should not stand in fear. I think we should just go forward with our lives and the heck with the man. He's sick jerk.
Great. Anybody else
I say slam Saddam.
Two days after the game, the president went before Congress to deliver his State of the Union address.
I come to this House of the People to speak to you and all Americans, certain that we stand at a defining hour. Halfway around the world, we are engaged in a great struggle in the skies and on the seas and sands. We know why we're there. We are Americans, part of something larger than ourselves. For 2 centuries, we've done the hard work of freedom, and tonight we lead the world in facing down a threat to decency and humanity. What is at stake is more than one small country. It is a big idea, a new world order, where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause to achieve the universal aspirations of mankind: peace and security, freedom, and the rule of law. Such is a world worthy of our struggle and worthy of our children's future.
Each day of the air war brought more visual evidence of what high-tech weapons such as smart bombs could do. Guided with precision by lasers or radar, these bombs fell on their targets with pinpoint accuracy. This had been a goal of airmen ever since aerial warfare had begun.
Aerial bombing has a long history. It was started sort of informally in World War I, where aviators brought handmade bombs, almost grenades, and dropped them over the side by hand. Some people saw the utility in that and found ways of making it a little more formal, a little more precise. The sighting devices in World War I were one flew over and looked down and guessed. By World War II, there was a theory of bombing, and there was some equipment to help make a bombardier more effective. Norden bomb sights were one of the secrets that the Allies, the U.S., protected very well during World War II. But even with those sights, we had some great difficulty with maintaining what we chose to call precision daylight bombing. In World War II, about half the bombs that came off B-17s were outside a circle of 3,000 feet of diameter from the designated target. And this kind of accuracy made precision daylight bombing very difficult to do. We got more accurate as we got to the Korean War, and indeed our accuracies for about half the bombs were down to 400 feet. In Desert Storm, where the combat accuracy between where the half the bombs hit and where the briefer, or the intelligence officer, told the pilot that they should hit, was down in the 30 to 40 foot regime. But indeed there were some airplanes and some weapons that carry precision guidance to where the technology now can accomplish what the doctrine has held for some time. There were some weapons that if one wanted to hit the northwest corner of the building, one could do that within a couple of feet.
Meanwhile, we were achieving victory at sea. Although Iraq had a small navy, it had the potential to seriously damage the coalition's ships with missiles. Naval air power methodically destroyed any threat the Iraqis posed. However, the Iraqis were effective in seeding the waters with underwater explosives called mines.
Our tactics initially to go after mines at sea assumed a nice, lovely square minefield. Unfortunately, the Iraqis don't lay mines that way, nor did the Iranians during their time. They lay mine lines in random patterns. And so you have to go out and hunt the mine. And when you find one, you can't necessarily say, well, it's running this way or it's going that way, because you don't know which way this line was laid. And maybe there's another line laid in a different direction to it. What you have to do is you go out with a mine hunter, using the sonars and the TVs. You have to look underwater and see the mine, presuming it's a mine that's tethered to the bottom. Then you can send a remotely piloted vehicle, one of these little submersibles that runs out underneath the water, and it can look at it. They can say, aha, mine. In the case of the Allied minesweeps, they can attach an explosive, back off, and remotely detonate the explosive. Our older ones that we have out there, which, by the way, are 30 years old, you have to send a underwater demolition man to swim down to the mine, place a charge on the mine, back off from the mine, and then blow it up.
Two U.S. ships, the USS Princeton and the USS Tripoli, actually did strike mines and were ultimately forced from the war.
30 feet, up to 30 feet to 10 feet below the water line is where the approximate location is, over.
Roger, understand that the top part of the hole is 10 feet below the water line.
That's correct, and the bottom ledge of the hole is 30 feet below the water line.
Tell Jim to get a small chartlet with these two mine positions plotted so we can figure a way out of here. Bring it up here quickly.
And the metal plating is folded in approximately 7 feet.
What we learned about the war came mostly from the daily briefings held for the press in a room in the Pentagon and a hotel in Riyadh.
The first video is a railroad bridge. And obviously they have very limited rail lines, so when you take a railroad bridge out, it makes a big difference. We try and hit right near the shore, I've been told, because that's the most difficult to repair and does the most damage if you get in at that point. That's one end of the bridge. You'll now see the same bridge again. Notice that's where we hit before. The span's gone. We're now hitting the other end of that railroad bridge. I'm now going to show you a picture of the luckiest man in Iraq on this particular day. Keep your eye on the crosshairs. Right there. Look at here. Right through the crosshairs. And now in his rearview mirror,
For the air war on Iraq, the United States used a large array of aircraft. For example, there was the F-117A Air Force stealth fighter. This was the controversial plane designed to be invisible to enemy radar. First used in combat in Panama, it now stalked the night skies over Iraq and used lasers to guide its 2,000-pound bombs or HARM missiles to pinpoint landings on its targets. After the war, we would learn that the stealth, which comprised only 3% of the Allied Air Force, would account for 43% of the hits on strategic targets. There was another plane used by the Air Force that had seen combat before. It was the F-111 Aardvark bomber. Capable of flying twice the speed of sound, this was the plane that was used in 1986 to bomb Libya as Ronald Reagan went after Muammar Gaddafi. The camera footage that was returned from that encounter is still vivid in many memories. Another combat veteran was the venerable B-52G bomber. For more than 30 years, this has been the Air Force's main long-range bomber. These were the planes which prompted the phrase carpet bombing during the Vietnam War. They were able to drop tremendous tonnage from high altitudes and literally create hell on the ground. In Iraq, the B-52s flew from bases in England, Spain, and the Indian Ocean to drop their explosives on Saddam's Republican Guard. The F-16 Fighting Falcon Air Force attack plane proved to be very effective in the air war. This is a combination fighter and ground attack jet. It carries both air-to-air and air-to-ground missiles, as well as bombs and a 20-millimeter cannon. Its major use in this war would be to locate enemy tanks and artillery and point them out to other aircraft. The F-15 Eagle is one of the world's top warplanes. Using its extra fuel tanks, this fighter can fly more than 3,500 miles.
1037 last 2,500 feet above my head.
Yes, 37.
It's clear for takeoff.
Clear for takeoff.
Is it melt for a little bit? Punching on it.
All right. There we go. Persian Gulf 35 out of 1,000 for 4,000. All 35, die run radar, contact clear to climb on course. Gulf 35.
Piece of cake.
Excellent.
There's number 4 over there on your left, 8 o'clock.
The F-15 can carry more than 12 tons of bombs and still hold its own in air-to-air combat. These planes were equipped with infrared sensors, which enabled them to spot the heat given off by Iraqi tanks buried in the sand.
Contact the traffic, 10 on my nose. Copy. Contact. Copy, Gulf.
Silencing Iraqi anti-aircraft guns was to be the job of the F-4G Wild Weasel. The plane, loaded with electronic jamming devices and HARM anti-radar missiles, was designed to destroy the enemy's capacity to find our forces in the sky. Few people call the A-10 battlefield support jet by its right name, the Thunderbolt. Because of its ungainly design and its slow speed, the heavily protected plane earned for itself the affectionate nickname Warthog. But in spite of its hominess, the plane was highly regarded for its ability to fire armor-piercing shells and Maverick missiles at Saddam's tanks. When it came to killing, the A-10 was joined by a machine which was so complex that many thought it would break down in combat. This was the A-864 Apache helicopter flown by the United States Army. It looked like some kind of insect with its 8 laser-guided Hellfire missiles, its air-to-ground rockets, and 30mm rapid-fire cannon. In its first combat role, the Apache proved to be extremely effective. Out in the Persian Gulf, on our carriers, there was another air armada which attacked targets on the battlefield and in Iraq. There was the Marines' AV-8B Harrier. These planes, capable of takeoff from a carrier deck, were used for ground support. One of the aircraft's unusual features is the ability to point its jet blast downward so that it can land like a helicopter. This ability to hover also gives it the ability to stay over targets and destroy them with missiles or cluster bombs.
So it's good to go? Great. All right, thanks.
A jet that was a movie star was also in the fray. This is the Navy's F-14 Tomcat that was featured in the film Top Gun. It's a 2-seat air-to-air fighter built around a high-power radar system. Among its weapons is the Phoenix missile, which can destroy an enemy plane 100 miles away. And then there were the planes that kept everything working. planes like the E-3 AWACS Sentry. This was a Boeing 707 loaded with electronics and carrying a revolving radar antenna on its roof.
BREF of 152, gross weight of 304.
No enemy plane left the ground in Iraq without being seen on an AWACS screen.
The basic situation as we have it now is here we are randomly orbiting in this area. We're concentrating our surveillance in Kuwait. This is Kuwait City here, and of course Iraq. We're watching for any tracks at all. We're also keeping an eye over here in Iran. Here we have probably an Iranian airliner heading north. Not posing a threat, but we'll still keep an eye on him.
From this high-flying control tower, the Air Force was also able to keep order in the skies, directing Allied planes towards their targets.
Unknown and ID when given from Panther.
Keeping them from colliding in midair and directing them to rendezvous with airborne gas stations.
We want to make sure all this traffic near us has been identified either friendly or non-hostile to make sure that our orbit area is safe. We also direct them to their tankers to get them refueled and keep them air separation so we don't have any problems with mid-air collisions.
There's an F-18 coming in. As you can see, this gets really pretty. It also gets quite confusing because you've got an awful lot of airplanes floating around the area.
The KC-135 Stratotanker has been around for more than 40 years. Its only mission is to serve as a flying gas can. Because it can carry about 200,000 pounds of fuel, it has enabled combat planes to refuel and conduct long-range missions. Even before the hostilities began, the press pointed out that military restrictions on how they could cover the war ran the risk of being too stifling. The reporters wanted more hard information about what was happening, and they wanted the ability to collect it independently, to collect it themselves, not as part of organized pools and with the minimum of censorship. The severe constraints on unilateral reporting led CBS News correspondent Bob Simon, his producer, and his camera crew to go unescorted to a marker in the desert where the boundaries of Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait all meet. Leaving their vehicle behind, they took their camera equipment and walked into Kuwait, into the no man's land, between the opposing armies, to do their story. Bob Simon and his group never returned that day with their videotapes. We would not see them again or hear their tale of horror until the war ended 40 days later. In a measured response to the press's requests for more information, General Colin Powell explained what the military was doing in Operation Desert Storm.
Let me turn now to the Iraqi army in the Kuwaiti theater of operations. This is a large combined arms army. It has tanks, it has personnel carriers, it has air defense guns, it has very redundant, resilient communications between the different operating echelons of the Army. It has stockages of food, ammunition, and parts with the Army in theater, and they have a very elaborate supply system coming down from the interior of the country to sustain that Army. Our strategy to go after this Army is very, very simple. First, we're going to cut it off, and then we're going to kill it. To cut it off, that began last week when we started to go after the nerve center, the brains of the operation, the command and control of the operation, and the lines of communications that come out of Baghdad and other places in the country, flowing down the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, down these lines of communications to try to support somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 men down here in the Kuwaiti theater of operations. So all we have been doing to gain control over here and begin severing this and try to deaden the nerve endings up here all goes back to our original military objective to get rid of the army that is in Kuwait. They're going to dig in their lines of communication. They're going to put an overhead cover. Those tanks are designed not to be easily destroyed. And so going after that kind of unit is a much more difficult proposition, but they are vulnerable. There's no question about it. And we are now turning our attention and selecting munitions and selecting target packages to go after that army, which in effect is sitting out there not doing anything. It has not moved since the operation began. There's been no major, in fact, there have been no minor shifts of units around. It is, for the most part, sitting there, dug in, waiting to be attacked, and attacked it will be.
A week after the air war began, reconnaissance photos showed an ecological nightmare beginning to take place. The U.S. said that the Iraqis had sabotaged a Kuwaiti supertanker terminal to allow thousands of barrels of crude oil to flow directly into the waters of the Persian Gulf. Each day, the volume of oil increased until it was widely believed that it was more than 6 times greater than the amount of oil spilled in the Exxon Valdez disaster. As the enormous slick moved south, nature itself became another casualty of Saddam Hussein's desperation.
This was the original oil spill before we took any military action against the Manifolds. I told you we weren't sure what we had done, but the next day, this was the result where we had already diminished. I am very proud to tell you that yesterday, this is the result of that area. Blue water, no more oil slick out there, and the United States military is very proud of any role we may have played in doing away with this ecological act of terrorism.
By now, Allied planes were flying thousands of daily missions against Iraqi installations and troops. As the numbers of enemy tanks and weapons destroyed mounted, focus began to shift to the second phase of the campaign, the war that Saddam wanted most, the war on the ground. Up until now, the number of Allied casualties had been extremely light, but that was expected to drastically change when the charge across the minefields and through the trenches began. America feared that Saddam, who had used poison gas in the Iran war and against his own people, the Kurds, would use it against the Allies. Another deep concern, were our well-trained but inexperienced troops up to facing Iraq's war-hardened veterans?
In addition to straight numerical disadvantage to our side and advantage to the Iraqis, there are other aspects of the Iraqi army that presented problems when you thought about how you're going to fight them. One, their army had fought 8 years. They were combat veterans. They'd been through shelling. They'd been through heavy attack. They'd been overrun, and they'd counterattacked, and they had been victorious in a very, very bloody war. Our kids had not heard a shot fired in anger. Vietnam was, what, 18 years ago? And the veterans of that war were now colonels and generals. So they who would lead the men into battle, in the battle, and the troops themselves, were young men who knew nothing about war. Highly trained, yes, in exercises, but never shot. So there was a question, I think, in everyone's mind about that first clash. When we met them, how quickly would our troops adapt to the battlefield and living on the battlefield vis-a-vis those that had been on the battlefield? There are other aspects. The Republican Guard. The Republican Guard was an elite force. It was equipped with the best he had, the T-72 tanks, the 155 guns that were procured from South Africa and from other sources that outranged our guns. I said our guns were 16 to 18,000 yards. Theirs were ranging out to 26,000 yards. They also had a wide array of small arms, mortars, and artillery that went all the way from 122 all the way up to 152 Soviet. That's in addition to the other kinds of things. They knew how to use that equipment. We had seen them in the offenses of 1988, when the Republican Guard had moved rapidly, quickly, and most effectively. How they would fight against us, how they would operate. Would they have the same kinds of successes? A question was, could they use the night? Now, we said we owned the night. But we had been in other places where we said we owned the night, and the enemy didn't have air. Korea was certainly one where the Chinese fought and never had an air force. Vietnam, the most recent example. Would these guys be able to figure out how to live under air attack and how to work at night, even though we had these new devices as yet untried? But would he be able to do that and thereby thwart some of our offensive plans?
On January 29th, the first large ground battle of the war took place 13 miles south of the Kuwaiti border in a deserted Saudi Arabian town called Apache. 9 brigades of an Iraqi mechanized division had crossed into Saudi territory, and some had captured the abandoned town. When Saudi and Qatari troops, supported by U.S. forces, re-entered the town, they found the Iraqi tanks with their gun turrets turned to the rear in the classic posture of tank surrender. But then the turrets suddenly swung around and the Iraqis began to fire. The Iraqi thrust appeared to be an attempt to provoke the Allies into starting the larger ground war.
Number 5, 1 round. Deflection 3261.
3261.
Quadrant 205.
205.
Charge 7, white bag. Charge 7. Number 5, stand by. 5.
205.
Charge 7, white bag. Charge 7, white bag.
Ripper, this is 311. Roger, over.
After 36 hours of fierce fighting, the Iraqis were repelled and hundreds surrendered when U.S. Marines and Saudis counterattacked. The battle was the first test of the U.S. and its allies' ability to move rapidly while coordinating air and artillery support. It was also a preview of how the Iraqi army would respond when the full-scale ground war began. At the Battle of Apache, we learned that Saddam's army could fight, but could not work effectively as a unit. We also learned that their equipment, their tanks and guns, were in terrible shape. General Schwarzkopf was quoted as saying, "The Battle of Apache led us to believe that we were really going to kick this guy's tail." Another event took place at Apache. Specialist 4 Melissa Rathburn-Neely of Grand Rapids, Michigan, was captured by the Iraqis as she was driving supplies towards the action. In this conflict, she became the first of 2 American female prisoners of war.
We have had women in the armed forces to varying degrees throughout all our wars, nurses, one thing or another. But never have we sent our women to war in such numbers. And they did well. Our women have done exceptionally well over there. I don't see any way that we're going to turn back the hands of time and take women away. They proved to be as courageous and as hardworking as the men. But it is certainly the first time we've had women in that dimension and in that depth. They're in every unit except the very frontline units, and even then they're pretty close. You had communication unit, gallows piling helicopters, and had there been, for example, an offensive on the part of the Iraqis, our women would have been in the fighting. They were just too close not to be.
I think if you talk to women who are professionally in the military, we see ourselves as soldiers. We don't really put it into perspective as men versus women.
There are problems we know about. Single parents, what to do with the children. When both parents go to war, how do you work that? These were things, I think, that we look through a little bit ahead of time. We hadn't really thought about that. Now we have to recognize that when you take whole families or you take a single parent to a battle, you have to make some arrangements for the children. And what do you do about that?
Remember, even though Mama and Daddy have to be here, we love both of you very much. Be a good girl and take care of your brother.
At the war's beginning, Saddam Hussein had called upon Arabs throughout the world to rise up and support him, but few heeded his plea. One person who did was Jordan's King Hussein. In the 4th week of the war, he addressed his nation and denounced the coalition as a, quote, war against all Arabs and Muslims.
We are Arabs, we are one nation, we should stand together no matter what, against the whole world.
Secretary of State James Baker said that the king had chosen the wrong side and that the United States would review a $50 million aid package for Jordan. On February 9th, Secretary Cheney and General Powell arrived in Saudi Arabia for a meeting with General Schwarzkopf and his staff. The purpose was to determine the progress of the air war and to set a timetable for the beginning of the combined air-land offensive. As the preparations for the ground battle continued, some congressional leaders urged a delay in its start, hoping the air war would cause Saddam to give up Kuwait. President Bush said we would take all the time the field commanders felt necessary. As the air pounding being given the Iraqis became more furious, it became obvious that from now on, major wars would be fought differently, that the high-tech battlefield had worked and was here to stay, that the side that owned the technology and the night had the greatest advantage.
In both the Korean War and the Vietnam War, it was apparent that our enemies were exploiting deficiencies that we had in terms of keeping track of what happened at night and being able to respond and react to enemy maneuvers and to enemy attacks that occurred at night. And so we had a concentrated effort going on to develop the technology, to field the technology, and then to do the training to exploit the technology of night fighting, both within our tanks and within our helicopters and within our airplanes. We had developed systems that essentially turned night into daytime. And this was I think a great threat. This was a great surprise, indeed a great shock to the Iraqi forces when they found that U.S. forces had the same efficiency, and indeed in some cases greater efficiency in operating at night than we did in daytime.
Much has been made of smart weapons in terms of the accuracy flying in the window, and also cost, the great cost of these weapons. Now, what we're looking at is a progression in warfare. Where the best you could do in previous warfare was gross kinds of things. Drop a whole bunch of bombs and hope it would hit whatever you were aiming at. Now, in order to do that, it took an awful lot of whatever you were using. And it took a lot of doing it over and over again, which meant whoever was doing it, being an aviator, being somebody on the ground, had to expose himself over and over again. And your results were not always very sure. Now, part of the new war is the high accuracy of your weapons, whether you're using it in a strategic sense, like we used against Baghdad, against power lines, bridges, and that sort of thing, or whether you're using it from ground-launched weapons to hit tanks, and we saw the pictures of a tank turret blown off. You have now saved yourself men. You have saved yourself cost. You have saved yourself time. And mostly you're inflicting great shock at little cost to you on the enemy by doing this. So the smart weapon is simply an evolution along the progression of battlefield.
As smart as the smart weapons were, there were mistakes in the war, mechanical as well as human mistakes. The bombs and missiles, obediently following the orders they had been given, sometimes hit friendly forces.
Now, there was an incident yesterday in which an American A-10 inadvertently fired on 2 of our infantry fighting vehicles. The aircraft was one of several which had been called in to deal with an enemy position, and the incident itself is, of course, under investigation. the incident accounted for 9 of our dead, you will understand that that is a matter of particular sadness, both to ourselves and to the American forces.
And sometimes when they hit an enemy bunker in Baghdad, they did not know who was inside. Suddenly, the gee-whiz high-tech war was no longer spotlessly clean. There were real victims and the stunning sight of real bodies. Perhaps as many as 300 civilians died in the attack. But Washington insisted that this was primarily a military command post, not a civilian air raid shelter, and that Iraq deliberately had allowed innocents to be in harm's way. At the height of the shock, Saddam Hussein tried to divert attention away from what had happened by making a peace offer. He said he would get out of Kuwait and a ground war could be averted, but certain conditions had to be met.
Regrettably, the Iraq statement now appears to be a cruel hoax, dashing the hopes of the people in Iraq and indeed around the world. It seems that there was an immediate celebratory atmosphere in Baghdad after this statement. And this reflects, I think, the Iraqi people's desire to see the war end, a war the people of Iraq never sought.
By mid-February, the U.S.-led coalition was better equipped and, at 700,000 strong, had more troops in the theater than the Iraqis. But the enemy still had a major advantage. Saddam's army had used the 5 months since their invasion of Kuwait to turn the desert into a maze of trenches, bunkers, and death traps. The plan was to bog down the Allied armies and inflict tremendous casualties until they lost their will to continue.
You get into your anti-tank minefield, okay? Then you get into some wire after that, and then you get into a huge anti-personnel minefield from 30 to 60 meters in depth. This minefield has directional frags, toe poppers, and claymores. It's got mines like this, the PMN. Very simple mine. The Soviets had used this in Afghanistan. 3 to 5 pounds of pressure, it blows your foot off. Defector came across the border a couple nights ago. He brought the CO's Jeep with him. In the back was a bunch of boxes that said PMN. It's a very effective mine. That much, your foot's missing. This is to take it all the way off about to the knee. He buries these in, you can't see them. He puts these in. He also puts mines like this in. Every one of his soldiers carries a mine like this in his rucksack. It's called a Palm Z. It's a directional frag. This little thing here, he puts 2 pieces of fish wire on it, goes out about 20 feet on either side. You come in, you stumble into that, it goes off. He bought 3.5 million of this mine. This is a state-of-the-art, Valmara 69. It's a huge plastic bouncing bitty. It's plastic outside, inside serrated metal, 1 buckshot. Jumps up in the air, has a lanyard, goes about this high. It goes off, multi-directional. It's not like our M16 that jumps up and shreds down. This thing's meant to kill you. You can either trip wire it with a little hole here out 25 meters, 2, 3 trip wires. Once again, he makes them so that you get 1 or 2 of them when you go in there. Or if one guy gets it from this way, another guy will get it from another way. He's daisy chaining them. This thing will either tilt like this and go off or go down. He's got 3.5 million of these that he bought. He also makes them in-house. It's got a lanyard on it, black powder charge, it works. It's great.
They were masters at fortification. They knew how to dig in. They had done it. They knew how to prepare defensive positions. And when you looked at the maps, you would see, for example, for a division, a triangle about 10 miles long and about 3 miles deep. What was inside that triangle? First, you had a big earthen berm. Now, what's a berm? Big pile of sand. And the idea was that the enemy, us, would have to run your tank up and you'd get shot at. You'd have to send your infantry over the top and you'd get shot at. Now, having got through that first berm, as we call it, they immediately put anti-tank ditches behind it. Now, these things were quite deep, maybe 20 to 30 feet wide. And again, the idea to stop your tank or stop your fighting vehicle like the Bradley and make you have to get down in this thing or cover it somehow and get across the other side. Again, while they're firing at you. And then in some cases, they indeed did have these ditches rigged so that they could put oil in it and set a fire, which clearly added to the complication. Now, having got across the first berm and through this great big anti-tank ditch, the next thing you ran into were minefields. And they had both anti-tank and anti-personnel mines in them, and those were all covered with wire, which presented even more of an obstacle. Then beyond that was their own fortifications, in which the infantry was dug in such a way that the artillery was not supposed to be able to get them. Their tanks were dug in, and their artillery was dug in. And there are 5 lines of those that just look just like that.
While Saddam's army prepared for their World War I-style trench warfare, the U.S. and its allies had other ideas in mind, ideas that went back to some of the famous battles of World War II. German General Erwin Rommel had written the book on tank warfare in the desert. His Africa Corps excelled at swift, unexpected thrusts. Rommel not only laid out the tactics for victory in tank warfare, but also showed how to achieve certain defeat. On a drive to take the port city of Alexandria during World War II, Rommel's tanks outran his supply lines. Without fuel, they became stationary targets for British air power. From the outset of Desert Storm, American commanders had their sights on the huge open Iraqi desert that lay to the west of Kuwait, beyond Saddam's fortifications. If the U.S. and its allies could fight a fast-moving, mechanized battle here, and if we could avoid Rommel's mistake by keeping supplies up with our tanks, then here, miles from the dug-in Kuwait front, was the place we would quickly win the war.
We have the fuel. Without us, they can't go anywhere. We're the in-between parts. They bring it to us, and we have to get it into the trucks and get it out of here. It doesn't go anywhere without us.
America's army had modern high-tech weapons. It was a 21st century fighting machine designed to be fast, violent, and accurate. A mainstay was the M1A1 Abrams tank. It has super strong armor made from depleted uranium, which can resist anti-tank shells. Operated by a 4-man crew, it has a 120mm cannon that can be aimed and fired while the tank is on the move, a feature not found on Iraq's Russian T-72 tanks. The Abrams, battle-tested for the first time in Desert Storm, has a gas turbine engine which can speed it along at almost 42 miles per hour. But it's a gas guzzler, getting about 2 gallons to the mile. The Marines brought along their old M60 tank, a technology almost 30 years old. Instead of walking into battle behind the tanks, the infantry in this war would follow closely behind in M2, M3 Bradley fighting vehicles. Equipped with light armor, these speedy troop transports can keep up with a rapid armor advance into enemy territory. The Bradleys had experienced numerous callbacks for modifications. How well this new system would work in war was one of the questions that would take actual combat to answer. Because of Saddam's reliance on a large tank force, an important weapon the U.S. brought to the battlefield was the TOW missile. An operator looking through its sight keeps his crosshairs on the target while the missile unspools the wires that control it. Highly effective, it can kill a tank at a range of 2 miles. The M110 Howitzer is an artillery piece mounted on a mobile platform. While it can toss 200-pound shells nearly 10 miles, its range is far short of Saddam's superior artillery. However, its mobility is an advantage, allowing it to move in, fire, and move on before the enemy can zero in on its location. An awesome weapon is the Mlrs, the Multiple Launch Rocket System. This mobile weapon can fire 12 missiles, each containing 6 radar-equipped bombs. Its firepower can blanket a large area and can silence enemy artillery or destroy oncoming tanks and troop carriers. To get across minefields safely, the Allies plan to use devices like the Miklik. It uses a rocket to send a rope of explosives across the dangerous field ahead. When it is detonated, it blows up the mines hidden in the sand to provide a safe path for the infantry to follow. There was another unique weapon system sent in as well. It was not at all exotic or high-tech. It was a technology that American kids had pioneered on the desert of California. These were dune buggies. With mufflers to silence their engines, they carried U.S. Special Forces teams deep into Iraqi territory. These teams helped pave the way for both the air and the ground war by locating and marking targets for destruction. As the final outcome of the war became clear, Saddam Hussein ordered his forces to begin a scorched earth policy against Kuwait's oil fields. More than 600 wells were set on fire, belching black, sooty, toxic smoke into the clear skies of the Persian Gulf. These hellish infernos reversed the order of day and night. Satellite photos showed the man-made clouds drifting over the desert. The fires will take months, perhaps even years, to put out. And so, joining the tragic victims of Saddam's holy war were the land, the sea, and the air itself, the precious environment of much of Asia. As the ground war seemed to be approaching its inevitable start, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev got into the act. He sent his emissary to Baghdad in a last-ditch bid to bring about a diplomatic solution to the crisis. The Soviets, who had backed the UN resolutions, had committed neither troops nor materiel to the war effort. Now, at the last moment, perhaps as a way of trying to gain influence in the post-war Arab world, they offered Saddam Hussein a peace plan. It provided him a lengthy ceasefire period during which he would have time to remove his army, virtually intact, from Kuwait. Saddam's minister, Tariq Aziz, went to Moscow and told the Soviets the Iraqis would indeed accept their plan for a ceasefire. But there were certain provisos attached. George Bush politely rejected the Russian proposal and said we would accept no conditions other than Iraq's complete compliance with the resolutions set by the United Nations. President Bush gave Saddam Hussein an ultimatum.
I have decided that the time has come to make public with specificity just exactly what is required of Iraq if a ground war is to be avoided. Most important, the coalition will give Saddam Hussein until noon Saturday to do what he must do: begin his immediate and unconditional withdrawal from Kuwait. We must hear publicly and authoritatively his acceptance of these terms.
The noon deadline came and went with no sign that the Iraqi forces had begun to withdraw from Kuwait. Shortly after 8 p.m. Eastern U.S. time on the evening of Saturday, February 23rd, CBS News was broadcasting a special report about the ongoing air war and what appeared to be the start of the ground war when the first concrete evidence and testimony were received that the ground battle to free Kuwait indeed had actually begun. From the war zone, late reports from all along the front lines indicate that the massive U.S.-led ground war offensive has begun to roll. At the very least, early parts of it are now stabbing into southern Iraq and Kuwait. This is one reason we're on the air at this time. We'll be monitoring the situation throughout this hour. President Bush today brushed off the latest bid by Saddam Hussein for a face-saving way out of Kuwait, so the last deadline is passed, and the next round of the conflict is up to the two huge armies facing each other out there in the dark and in the sand. We go to David Martin at the Pentagon.
Dan, timing is everything, and that is about all that's left here. It's clear that the decision to launch a ground offensive has been made by the president and communicated to the commander in the field, General Norman Schwarzkopf. It is up to him now to decide exactly when and where to strike. I think the element of surprise is basically gone. Saddam Hussein had to know that an attack would come after the noon deadline expired and probably during hours of darkness. And the real question now is exactly where the U.S. is going to strike.
We have on the telephone now, for how long we do not know, CBS reporter Bob McEwen, who is 1 mile from the border with Kuwait. Bob, tell us what you see and hear and what's going on there.
Usually the bombardment here in the time we've been here for the past 4 or 5 days has taken place mostly at night. At 9 o'clock yesterday morning, there was bombardment from every direction, from a warship, presumably the Wisconsin or the Missouri out in the Gulf, from artillery and overhead from bombers. And under that cover, the tanks that had arrived from the west moved along the sand wall, the 12-foot sand wall that's a mile from us along the border, and moved into position. So the front moved up. We, at first light this morning, can't see them. We don't know if they're still there. We don't know if they've moved over the night. But one thing we can tell you is that the bombardment last night, and it continues to this moment, has been exceedingly heavy, heavier than anything we have heard. We were watching it last night. Because of the oil in the sky, we couldn't see the flashes. We could hear the booms, the ground rumble.
Stand by. Fire!
40.2. 3419.
Meanwhile, in the waters off Kuwait, the naval forces opened up again with the antique power of bygone wars. But what a power it was. If Saddam Hussein believed the Allies would never meet him head-on, he was wrong once again.
He now has the mother of all battles that he wanted. This isn't really the mother of all battles. In many ways, it's the daughter of all his illusions and miscalculations. A little knowledge, it's often said, could be a dangerous thing. Saddam Hussein doesn't really know much about America. He had little fragments in his mind. He knew about Vietnam. He knew about what happened in Lebanon. But what he didn't calculate and what he didn't factor into his calculations was the fact that he was going to be facing a president molded by World War II. So Saddam has this ground battle he wants. On some level, it is a product of all his miscalculations. On yet another level, this is really his hope, because in the end, his hope was always the fact that the ground battle is the great equalizer. If you listen to him, if you read some of his speeches, Saddam Hussein has a very primitive view of warfare. He's talked about air power as a kind of something that real men don't do. Real men don't use air power, that they go to ground warfare. So he has this battle now, and he has it on the ground.